It's been about a month or so, and the first two banners of Honkai Star Rail 1.0 is nearly gone. Overall, 1.0 seems to have focused more on DPS characters with its 5 stars, but in 1.1, the two 5 stars are more focused around support, with Silverwolf being a quantum debuffer and Luocha being an imaginary healer. Both these characters are really good, but also really divisive, with the community sort of split on who is the better choice. So with that said, is Silverwolf worth summoning right now? Before we get into that, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Silverwolf is one of the most anticipated characters in Star Rail and has been mentioned several times to be a must pull, at least that was before. To understand why she's considered to be so good, let's take a look at her kit first. Generally, the way she functions involves debuffing enemies by reducing their defense, attack, speed, and even can add weaknesses. Her basic attack deals quantum damage and functions the same as any other basic, but because of her talent, she can debuff enemies through her basic attack as well. Each time she attacks, her talent gives her a chance to apply a random bug or debuff to the enemy that lasts for about 3 turns. The debuff is random and can either be an attack reduction, defense shred, or speed reduction. This means that as you naturally attack an enemy, it will progressively get weaker. Now, it's unclear whether these stack, but during the closed beta test, I believe they did up to 5, so I'll assume that functionality is still present. Her skill is where the uniqueness of her kit comes in. To put it simply, whenever you use her skill, it does 2 things. On top of dealing quantum-based damage, it firstly reduces all elemental resistance by a certain amount for 2 turns, making enemies take more damage. The second is that it can add an elemental weakness to the enemy that it currently doesn't have, based on the elements of your team. So say that the enemy is only weak against fire, and your team is all ice characters. When Silverwolf uses this ability, there is a chance that either ice or quantum weakness, since Silverwolf is in your team, gets added to the enemy. This means that if your team couldn't damage the toughness bar before, this ability essentially allows them to do so. This is what makes her so incredibly sought after, as on paper, she can essentially enable practically any team. There are caveats to this, but we'll talk about those a bit later. Last up is her ultimate, which is pretty straightforward. All it does is deal a big chunk of quantum damage and reduces the defense of the target by a fixed amount. It's essentially a defense shred. So that's basically her kit. Every action she takes makes the enemies weaker and in turn makes your team hit that much harder or take much less damage. Now keep in mind that the actual numbers here haven't really been revealed yet, and she has been changed from the closed beta test, so things may change further when she is officially launched. So back to the original question, is she worth summoning? In terms of positives, Silverwolf's kit is kinda unique, especially because of her skill. Every part of her kit has something that debuffs the enemy, so no matter what you're doing, the enemy is being weakened one way or another. Because some debuffs also work through her basic attack, she also generates skill points while continuing to debuff the enemy. Her skill also opens up a lot of different options because you can essentially apply weaknesses for elements that your team may not necessarily have. This can enable mono-element teams, give you better control in fights where you are just missing an element, and for a free-to-play player may even mean you won't need to build different characters of different elements. All of this means that in general, no matter what team you put Silverwolf in, she's going to benefit it one way or another. So if she's so functionally good, why has she gone from being a must-pull to being she's good with an asterisk? Well, the first problem is that some of these debuffs are random and have a certain success percentage. You can't control what debuffer talent will apply, and it might just decide to debuff the speed or something when that isn't particularly important at that given time. This also means that for boss enemies that have higher resistances, you may fail at applying these debuffs outright, but you can somewhat compensate for this with higher hit effect stats. A lot of her skills are also single target. In the current meta, most tough enemies are single bosses, so it's still somewhat okay. But the moment you start having several enemies on the field, her debuff isn't as effective unless you target only one enemy at a time. Spreading them to multiple enemies will reduce their overall effectiveness and will just take more time. In terms of defense shred alone, this is why some have compared her to Pela, who has an AoE defense shred. However, Silverwolf has a stronger one in terms of the number, but it's still single target. The skill that makes her so valuable also has some problems. While it does apply a weakness to the enemy, it doesn't completely remove the innate resistance that enemy might have. Adding an ice weakness to an enemy allows you to damage their toughness bar, but the damage you do overall may still be lower than if you just had a fire element character due to this innate weakness. The weakness application is also subject to RNG. If your team is made up of 4 different elements, Silverwolf will randomly apply a weakness from one of these 4 elements. There is a way to manage this though by building your team to have more of a similar type of element, but there is a chance that Quantum gets applied as Silverwolf is also there. The good thing is that if the enemy is already weak against a particular element, then the weakness won't be applied. So, for example, if the enemy is weak against Quantum and Fire, and your team is made up of Ice and Quantum characters, then Ice will be the one that gets applied. All of this just makes it seem that you have to plan around Silverwolf's skill rather than it being a Swiss Army knife that fits all situations. Finally, the thing that gets in Silverwolf's way the most isn't really even related to her at all. It's the fact that Luocha is coming right after her. Luocha is a healer that can debuff enemies, and without getting too much into his kit, all you need to know is that he's a pretty good healer. The fact that he is a healer, a class we are currently severely lacking right now, makes him even more valuable, while a debuffer isn't strictly necessary. Now, of course, the biggest reason why healers are so valuable at this time is really for the Forgotten Hall's Memory of Chaos, where you need 2 teams to clear it. So if you're not in a rush or even interested in this game mode, there really isn't any content right now that necessitates having 2 teams. That said, Luocha is also really good, so you may consider summoning for him if you like him, but this video isn't about Luocha specifically, so let's get back on track. At the end of the day, this decision isn't going to be an easy one. Silverwolf's kit is pretty unique, and as far as I know, there are no other characters that have this weakness adding mechanic in their own kits. This may very well change in the future, but for now, she's the only one who can do it. On top of that, it's difficult to gauge how valuable having this mechanic even is. Most teams right now rely on a buffer to boost a hypercarry, and whether you can give that slot up for a debuffer is questionable. Personally, I think that Silverwolf is good. She has a kit that is unlikely to be power crapped anytime soon and will benefit your team regardless. But whether she is a must summon really depends on your team. Ask yourself, if you do get her, would she immediately or automatically have a spot on your team, or would you need to make space? For me, I don't have Bronya, and I'm currently relying on Tingyun alone, so if I do get Silverwolf, I will likely have her immediately on the next team. I also don't have a second healer, but I do have Gepard and Yanqing, so with Silverwolf, it may allow me to run a mono ice team as my second team. So long story short, I think you should summon for her only if she can bring immediate benefits for your team, or if you really don't need that second healer. I don't think that she's bad at all, but as far as priorities goes, you might have more urgent needs such as that second healer, and even then, as I mentioned, only if you wish to clear Memory of Chaos right now. This one is a tough one to really recommend. I suggest waiting for a few days to see how she really performs once some of the math guys really test her out and put her through her paces. So make the decision on what's better for you, and if you like her purely for her appearance or her design or her lore even, then don't let me convince you otherwise. Silverwolf is overall a great character to have in your roster, but whether you absolutely need her, I think depends on you, and I can only share my opinions right now. Good luck on your summons, and if this has been helpful, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one. As usual, have a nice day.